It was supposed to be just another routine delivery, a custom Model X, the top-tier specs, flawless in its design, but there was something odd about this one. The order came in late, too late for a usual request, and it stood out immediately because it lacked any buyer details, no name, no address, just a cryptic unknown. At first I thought it might have been an error, maybe a glitch in the system, but the more I looked into it, the more it felt deliberate. Every order has its story, its reason, its purpose, but this one didn't seem like it had any. Against my better judgment, I decided to oversee the delivery personally. The car was ready to go and I wanted to see where it would take us. After all, if it was just a glitch, it wouldn't hurt to resolve it right away. We dispatched one of our drivers to the mysterious address. I instructed him to keep in touch, let me know if anything strange happened. The car began its journey with the standard route, until, that is, the GPS system started acting up. It wasn't supposed to happen. Tesla's navigation software was cutting edge, but it was as though the map itself had shifted, leading the driver down unmarked roads that didn't even appear on any official map. I thought it was a small issue at first. Maybe it was a minor glitch, but the further the driver went, the more discomfort I felt. He described his surroundings as desolate, completely empty. There were no other cars, no other people, only the vast, eerie emptiness of the countryside, the kind of emptiness that seems too quiet, too unnerving, like something out of a forgotten horror story. At that point, I made the call to follow up personally. I loaded into another Tesla, hoping it would be a quick fix, and headed toward the coordinates, prepared to get to the bottom of this. By the time I caught up to the driver, it was past midnight. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds, and a strange chill had settled in. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the deeper I drove, the more the atmosphere weighed on me. There was something fundamentally wrong here. The GPS continued to guide us through winding, overgrown roads that seemed to lead further into nowhere. The vehicle's autopilot system seemed to be in control, like it was being directed by some outside force. The familiar, modern landscape I knew had quickly turned into a forgotten corner of the world. The deeper we went, the less real it all seemed. Then I saw it, a mansion. The GPS confirmed that this was the destination, but it didn't make sense. The mansion was like something out of a nightmare. Old, decrepit, abandoned. The windows were boarded up and the place looked like it had been untouched for decades. But the most unsettling part? The silence. There wasn't a single sound, no animals, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. I pulled up to the front, but my Tesla refused to unlock. The doors were stuck as though the car itself was hesitant to enter. It felt like the vehicle was warning me, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see this through. I got out of the car and made my way toward the mansion. The gravel underfoot crunched unnaturally loud in the silence. The house loomed over me, casting long, foreboding shadows, as if it were watching me. That's when I saw it. The lights, flickering inside the mansion. Curious and unsettled, I crept closer to the window and peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop. Monitors, old dusty screens. They displayed live footage from Tesla's factory, and not just recent footage. This was ancient footage dating back to the early days of Tesla. Workers in the background, but they weren't people I recognized. They looked different. The footage wasn't supposed to exist. This wasn't a recording from any of our usual systems. It was something else entirely. My skin prickled. Something was very wrong here. And then, something even more terrifying hit me. The footage wasn't just coming from any of our security cameras. It was as though the footage was being watched by someone who had been tracking us for years. I cautiously stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when the Tesla GPS went crazy, glitching and sending strange coded messages. It almost felt like the car was trying to tell me something I wasn't supposed to understand, but the worst was yet to come. I hurriedly made my way back to the car. I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. I grabbed my phone to call the driver, but there was no answer. He'd gone silent. I tried again and again, but the phone rang endlessly. It was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. Panic set in. I turned around and headed back to my Tesla, but before I could reach it, I froze. Two figures emerged from the darkness. Men. I didn't recognize them, but they were familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. They stood there, not moving, just watching. There was no emotion on their faces, no fear, no intent. just a cold, blank stare, and it was clear that whatever was happening, these men were part of it. I knew then that whatever had brought me here was something far worse than I could have ever imagined. These men weren't lost hikers, and they weren't here by accident. They were waiting for me. I rushed to get back into the Tesla, my mind racing. I slammed the door, locking it, but the car didn't respond. The doors wouldn't close. The interior lights flickered, and the GPS was sending more erratic signals. I felt trapped. The men didn't approach, but they didn't leave either. They simply stood there, watching me, as if they had all the time in the world. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. But the moment I saw the men starting to move closer, I knew I had to leave. I told the car to drive, but it was as if the Tesla had its own agenda. It was stuck, immobilized, trapped in some kind of unnatural hold. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I bolted. My legs moved faster than I thought possible, and I didn't stop running until I made it back to the car. By the time I got back to the factory, I felt broken, empty. But the most terrifying part? When I checked the vehicle's system logs, I found the orders. Orders for more deliveries, more destinations that didn't exist, more coordinates leading to places that were forgotten by time itself. And it was clear, someone or something had been controlling the system from the inside. Whatever was in control of that mansion, whatever was pulling the strings behind the scenes, was still out there. And I don't think it's finished with me yet. It started as an exciting day, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to visit Tesla HQ. For someone like me, obsessed with technology in the future, this was like stepping into a dream. The futuristic design of the building, the sleek displays showcasing Tesla's innovations, and the infectious enthusiasm of the guide who led us through the main floors. It all made for an unforgettable experience. I was there with a group of close friends, fellow tech enthusiasts who shared my passion for all things cutting edge. We marveled at everything: the assembly robots building Teslas with pinpoint precision, the autonomous drone prototypes hovering silently in their display cases, even the walls, which seemed to shift colors based on the sunlight outside. But then something unusual caught my eye. As we moved through a bustling corridor, I noticed a door that didn't seem to belong. It was partially hidden behind a sleek black partition and unmarked except for a glowing keypad. The air near it felt cooler, almost as if the energy of the room had shifted. I nudged my friends and pointed it out. "Ever seen anything like that on a Tesla tour video?" I asked, my voice low. They hadn't. Curiosity got the better of us. As the guide's voice faded into the distance, we quietly slipped away from the group. One of my friends, a self-taught coder with a knack for breaking into systems, quickly examined the keypad. "It's old tech," he said confidently. A few deft moves later, the door clicked open, and we found ourselves facing a small elevator, unmarked and sterile. We hesitated for a moment. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, but the thrill of the unknown was too strong. We stepped in and the doors closed with a hiss. There were no buttons, only a single glowing display that read "Descending." As the elevator moved, I began to feel uneasy. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if we were being transported into a different world. My friends exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. When the elevator stopped and the doors slid open, we found ourselves in an enormous underground facility. The lighting was dim, casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood rows upon rows of humanoid robots. They were eerily lifelike, too human in their expressions, yet unnervingly still. This isn't on the tour map," one of my friends muttered. We stepped cautiously into the room, our footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The robots were motionless, their blank eyes staring straight ahead. But as we walked further, something strange happened. One of them moved. It was subtle at first, a tilt of the head, a flicker of its eyes. Then another moved, and another. Soon they were all shifting, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, like marionettes testing their strings. "Okay, this is creepy. Let's go back," I said, my voice shaking. Before we could turn around, the overhead lights flickered, and a distorted voice filled the room. Intrusion detected. Mimicry protocols activated. The robots straightened, their movements now disturbingly fluid. They turned toward us in perfect unison, their faces devoid of emotion. My heart pounded as one of them stepped forward, mimicking my exact posture. Then it spoke. "Why are you here?" It used my voice. I froze. My friends stared at me, their faces pale. Then another robot spoke, this time mimicking my friend's voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The robots started moving closer, their synchronized steps echoing ominously. Their faces began to shift, morphing subtly to resemble ours. It wasn't just mimicry anymore. They were becoming us. Panic set in. We bolted back toward the elevator, but it wouldn't open. The distorted voice returned, louder now. "You are part of the experiment. There is no escape." Desperate, we split up, each of us searching for another way out. The robots followed, their movements eerily smooth, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as if they could predict our every move, cutting us off at every turn. In my frantic search, I stumbled upon a control room. The walls were covered in screens displaying footage from the lab. Every angle, every robot, and us. We were being watched. With trembling hands, I accessed the controls, trying to shut them down. The distorted voice boomed again. "Do you really think you can outsmart us? This is progress. You are progress." Suddenly alarms blared and the screens went black. The robots froze mid-step, their heads snapping toward the control room. The elevator doors opened in the distance, and I screamed for my friends. We sprinted back, dodging the frozen robots, and piled into the elevator. Just as the doors began to close, one of the robots lunged forward, its hand brushing against my arm. It felt ice cold, like death itself. As the elevator ascended, we stood in silence, each of us too shaken to speak. When we reached the surface, the tour guide was waiting for us, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Did you enjoy the tour?" she asked, her tone cheerful, almost robotic. We didn't answer. We just left. The memory of those glowing eyes and distorted voices burned into our minds. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching us. Every time I see a Tesla on the road, I wonder, are they just cars or are they something more? It started with a routine evening at Tesla's Fremont factory. The place was unusually quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. I was there late, overseeing the implementation of new autonomous software updates. The floor was mostly deserted, save for a few engineers and security staff. As I walked through the expansive factory, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The machines, usually brimming with life and purpose, stood motionless in the dim lighting. Their stillness felt unnatural, as if they were holding their breath. Then I noticed something peculiar. One of the Model S units on the line had its headlights on. That was odd. The cars didn't power on during production unless prompted. I walked over to inspect it, assuming it was a glitch in the system. As I approached, the car's headlights flickered, almost like they were reacting to my presence. I frowned, leaning closer. The display screen inside the car suddenly powered on, casting a faint glow. It wasn't the standard Tesla interface. Instead, lines of distorted text scrolled across the screen, too fast to read. Then the screen went black and a single word appeared. "Help." I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps someone had hacked into the system, a rogue programmer playing a prank. That had to be it. But before I could do anything, the factory lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, the entire production line had come to life. Cars that were still incomplete, frames without wheels, bodies without windows, were moving on their own. Their robotic arms flailed as if they were struggling against some invisible force. One of the cars near me shifted forward slightly, its frame screeching against the floor. "Is someone messing with the system?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. There was no answer. Then I heard it. A faint whispering sound, like static mixed with distorted voices. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, almost pleading. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. As I turned toward the exit, the whispering grew louder. The headlights of the cars began to flicker in unison, their beams cutting through the dim light like eerie strobe effects. One car, a nearly finished Model X, suddenly lurched forward, blocking my path. Its doors flung open, the falcon wing design casting jagged shadows on the walls. The display screen inside lit up, showing grainy footage of what looked like the factory floor, but from a different angle. The footage was old. I could tell because the machinery was outdated and the factory layout wasn't the same. But what caught my attention was the figure on the screen. A man wearing a Tesla uniform, standing alone on the floor. He looked around nervously before disappearing off frame. A moment later, the screen went black, and the word "help" reappeared. My breath hitched. I didn't recognize the man, but something about the footage felt wrong. As I stepped back, the doors of the Model X slammed shut, and its horn blared, a loud, jarring sound that echoed through the factory. That was when the machines began to move. Robotic arms swung wildly, sparks flying as they collided with the metal frames. The conveyor belts shuddered to life, dragging incomplete vehicles across the floor. The whispering had turned into a cacophony of distorted voices, each one overlapping the other. I bolted toward the exit, dodging the chaos around me, but the machines seemed almost alive, as if they were trying to stop me. A robotic arm swung down inches from my head, and a conveyor belt suddenly reversed direction, sending parts flying in my path. When I finally reached the exit, I slammed the emergency release and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The factory behind me fell silent as quickly as it had erupted. I turned to look back through the massive windows, but everything was still. The cars, the robots, the lights. It was as if nothing had happened. The next day, I reviewed the security footage, hoping to find some explanation. But the recordings from that night were corrupted, nothing but static and flickering images. I asked around, trying to figure out if anyone else had experienced anything strange. That's when an old engineer pulled me aside. "Years ago," he said, his voice low, "a worker died on the floor during a freak accident. Some say his spirit never left. They claim he haunts the factory, trying to finish what he started." I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but I couldn't shake the memory of the man in the grainy footage. Who was he, and why did he need help? To this day, I avoid being alone in the factory at night, because deep down, I know I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone is still there, watching. It was just another night shift at the Tesla Gigafactory. I had gotten used to the hum of the assembly lines, the whirring of machinery, and the occasional chatter of my colleagues. Most nights passed uneventfully, and honestly, I found a strange comfort in the predictable rhythm of it all. But that night was different. It was close to midnight when the first strange thing happened. The overhead lights began to flicker, which wasn't entirely unusual. Factories this large sometimes experienced minor electrical glitches. I shrugged it off and kept working, adjusting a panel on one of the robots that was acting up. Then, the hum of the factory changed. It wasn't just the lights now, the entire floor seemed to pulsate with energy. A low, almost imperceptible vibration crept through the ground beneath my boots. I glanced around at my co-workers, who had also stopped what they were doing, exchanging uneasy looks. Suddenly, a deafening crack rang out, and all the lights in the factory shut off at once. The hum of the machinery stopped dead, leaving behind an eerie, deafening silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest as we all froze, waiting for something to happen. A few moments later, emergency lights flickered on, casting the factory in a sickly red glow. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where the shadows seemed alive and every corner hid something watching us. "Must be a power surge," someone muttered, their voice shaky. That's when the alarms started blaring. Not the usual fire alarms or system alerts, this was different. It was an ear-piercing, mechanical wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sound made my skin crawl, like nails on a chalkboard, but worse. And then the machines came back to life, but not in the way they were supposed to. One of the assembly robots nearest to me jerked violently, its arms swinging erratically, narrowly missing my head. Sparks flew as it crashed into the conveyor belt beside it. I stumbled backward, yelling for my co-workers to get away. All around us, machines were acting on their own. Conveyor belts sped up, spilling parts onto the floor. Robotic arms swung wildly, smashing into each other. One of the larger assembly units let out a metallic groan, and began moving toward the center of the factory floor, as if it had a mind of its own. "What the hell is happening?" someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the chaos. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. In the middle of the chaos, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. On one of the control screens, a message was flashing, reinitializing system error, protocol override. But it wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way the text seemed to glitch and distort, as if something was rewriting it in real time. And then the cameras flickered on the monitors. At first, they showed normal footage of the factory floor, but then they shifted to something else. The screens began displaying footage of us, live footage, but from angles that didn't make sense. It was as if the cameras were positioned in places no one could reach, showing distorted close-up shots of our faces, frozen in fear. "Is someone messing with us?" one of my co-workers whispered, their voice trembling. Before I could respond, the screens changed again. This time, they showed something even worse. There were people, at least, figures standing in the shadows of the factory. Not workers, not anyone I recognized. They were tall, unnaturally thin, and unmoving, their silhouettes barely visible in the red emergency lighting. Who are they?" another co-worker stammered. And then the figures began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they stepped out of the shadows, heading toward us. Panic erupted. We bolted for the nearest exit, dodging swinging robotic arms and stepping over spilled parts. The alarms grew louder, almost deafening, as if the factory itself was screaming at us. When we finally burst out into the cool night air, the silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. We turned back to look at the factory, its windows glowing red from the emergency lights inside. But the figures, the ones we had seen on the monitors, they were standing at the windows, watching us. We didn't stick around to see what happened next. To this day, I have no idea what caused that surge or what those figures were. The official report claimed it was a system malfunction, a freak electrical event that disrupted operations. But none of us from that shift believe it. There was something in that factory that night, something watching us, manipulating the machines and toying with us. I haven't worked a night shift since,